So a couple of months ago I came across this post on Facebook. Normally it's the sort of thing I'd scroll right past, but I saw that an old acquaintance of mine had commented saying that actually this basic concept exists in New York. It's a sports bar called Boxers. And you know, I couldn't just let that sit there because I went to a Boxers in 2012, and as I was in line for the restroom, which I suppose you could technically define as unisex, but which felt rather pointedly like a men's restroom that just didn't have a women's equivalent, multiple men looked at me like my skin was made of green glitter and said, "What are you doing here?" And I mean, the answer is that I was there for the birthday party of a friend who was a gay man, so point to you, bucko, but the point is that there's a fundamental disconnect between this post that lots of people shared like it was a novel idea and the fact that lots and lots of places exactly like this already exist in the form of cleverly named gay bars. What's novel about this theoretical Python's place isn't that it's objectifying men instead of women. It's the implicit claim that women might be interested in doing the objectifying. Hi, I'm Laura, and today we're finally gonna crack the female gaze.
She said, prove it, get sexy for me. Go on, prove it, get sexy for me. Get sexy for me.
But first, we're gonna talk about rom-coms. Magic Mike, you might be surprised to learn if you only saw the marketing for it, is a movie incredibly dense with baggage worth unpacking, and we're gonna start with its function as a romantic comedy because I said so. Meet Mike. He's a stripper. Sorry, male entertainer. But he's not just a male entertainer. He's got big dreams of owning his own custom furniture business.
I don't know, I'm waiting for the bank to make the competitive loans that I'm looking for, and then I'll swoop in.
Hello, ladies. He's also got a young, model-pretty, no-strings lover who's just as gung-ho and chill about using women as disposable objects for sex as Mike is.
I'm sorry, what's her name? You don't even know.
But watch out, looks like our boy's catching feelings for not that kind of girl, Brooke.
She's the dinner type.
Problem is, her feelings on stripping range from eye-rolling disinterest to active disdain.
I just can't be around your lifestyle.
Oh no! What's a guy to do? After a movie's worth of flirting with this girl who will never approve of his lifestyle, Mike finally leaves stripping behind, and he and Brooke finally get that breakfast, and everything that comes before. Sound familiar? This is essentially a take on the sex worker with a heart of gold trope. It's a tale as old as time. A woman trapped into sex work because it's there meets a good man who sees through the hardened, slutty exterior to the good, long-suffering woman beneath and eventually provides her with the means to escape her terrible, exploitative work situation, usually by swapping it out for his love for her. So let's just make the sex worker a guy and the savior a woman. Sounds good. Well, sort of. Some changes have been made to the fabric of this trope to make it function in this gender-bent form. To understand why, we've got to talk about heteronormativity and what it does to the romantic narrative sold to men and women who dig each other.
Get sexy for me. Get sexy for me.
A brief disclaimer, what we're talking about here are dominant cultural narratives. That doesn't necessarily mean that all men or all women or any individual man or woman will find these narratives to be the paragon of romance for them personally. It means that these are the stories that dominant culture repeatedly tells as romantic ideals, meaning, crucially, that they are considered to be reliably marketable. While this doesn't necessarily mean that they are reflective of any individual's desires, their prevalence has likely had some sort of unavoidable influence on many of the individuals who live in the culture selling them. Now, since the media monolith is just starting to realize that the LGBTQ+ population exists, much less has money to spend, much less would like to spend that money on stories where we can see ourselves represented as three-dimensional human beings, the most prolifically represented narratives tend to feature two distinct cis-heteronormative roles. The zoom-in details may differ depending on whether the story's audience is presumed to be primarily made up of straight men or straight women, but what we have are essentially two sides of the same coin. They need to be complementary because these people are going to go out and fall in love with each other. The sex worker with a heart of gold trope, as we are reminded in its prototypical form, Pretty Woman, has its roots in fairy tales.
I would pretend I was a princess trapped in the tower by a wicked queen. This knight on a white horse with these colors flying would come charging up and draw his sword. I just want to know who it works out for. Cinderella.
So what happened after he climbed up the tower and rescued her?
She rescues him right back.
For the man in the story, it's all about the fantasy of being the rescuer. Whether it's the strength and skill to slay a dragon or the cash to level up a lifestyle, it's about being powerful enough, endowed with enough of the trappings of straight masculinity, to rescue a pure woman from whatever external force is causing her woe. For the woman, on the other hand, it's about being rescued, being chosen. It's about being so special to this man that he will go to whatever incredible lengths to both rescue and possess her. The man desires, executes a rescue, and gains a partner who is indebted to his manliness. The woman is desired, incites a chase, and gains a partner who has proved his worthiness. Two fundamentally different, but definitionally complementary fantasies. So in the context of the sex worker with a heart of gold trope, sex work is the outside force from which the woman needs to be rescued. The backbone of this story is the idea that sex work is inherently exploitative and terrible for the women who do it. Part of that cultural narrative is tied up in a picture of strip clubs and brothels as just run-of-the-mill bad workplaces, run by gross despots who treat their employees like pieces of meat and set up a work environment that is all kinds of terrible while also being simultaneously lucrative enough to make it seem worth it for a while and impossible to make quite enough money to leave. But another, more important piece is our set of cultural ideas about how men and women relate to sex. Sex is something that women give and men take. It's something that women do for the sake of pleasuring men, or something that men manage to get women to do.
She's gonna be at the party, and she's gonna be drunk, and she likes me at least a little, enough to get with me.
Tied up in this is the idea of the lecherous patron. The good man in the story who sees the sex worker's golden heart is rescuing her, in no small part, from the drool of the, on the whole, terrible men for whom she performs her services. Simply swapping out the genders in a story like this one necessitates that men also be inherently exploited by the industry and plagued by lecherous female customers. You see where this is going? In order for men who strip for women to need rescuing, there needs to be a large customer base of women whose sexual desires at best don't take into consideration and at worst actively disdain men's pleasure. And in a culture that sees men's pleasure as the ultimate goal of all sex, to the point where it often features as the determining factor in defining whether or not sex even took place, that just doesn't compute. Now, this is one of those places where it's really important to be very explicit about the fact that we're not talking about real people living in the real world. There are plenty of women who work in the sex industry precisely because they find it to be enjoyable, fulfilling, empowering work. There are plenty of men who patronize women for sex work and are responsible and respectful about the exchange, and plenty of women who patronize men for sex work and are disrespectful and cross boundaries. But the existence of these actual people, even if they make up the vast majority of actual sex workers and actual customers, does not take away from the prevalence of the narrative in which sex work must be inherently exploitative for the women who do it, in no small part because the men who pay for it must be inherently lecherous in a way that women are incapable of. So Magic Mike puts a couple of twists on this narrative to fit it into the mold. Stripping isn't bad because it's an exploitative environment where Mike is plagued by sleazy customers. It's bad because it comes with a frat house party culture that makes him a terrible person. He has openly horrendous attitudes about women.
Look at what she's wearing! She came here tonight! Scooby Bob!
He enables Adam's self-destructive behavior.
We're gonna get tonight, huh?
His lifestyle is actively incompatible with being the kind of adult who can run a business. This plays directly into the variant of the heteronormative romantic rescue narrative that allows the woman to do the saving, the I can fix him trope.
We are so glad that you're here with us and in Christian's life. He never let anyone get close until you came along.
In this version, the danger isn't an external threat, it's internal. Brooke doesn't need to save Mike from a bad work situation, she needs to save him from himself. But of course she can't do it by nagging him. Nobody changes for a nag.
Did you just take my advice?
By what? By not telling him what to do?
Yeah.
No, I just don't have a choice.
She saves him by withholding any clear intent to get with him until he gets his shit together. See what I mean about sex being something that women give and men get? Put another way, she is the trophy that Mike gets for looking at his life, looking at his choices, and becoming a better, more adult person. If you've been paying very close attention, you might notice that while this means the trope is gender bent on the surface, he's in the bad sex work situation and she rescues him from it, the core gender roles remain intact. She is so inherently desirable that he takes action to win her over. He is the subject. She is the object. This dynamic is present in most heteronormatively romantic narrative tropes. The man does the work of pursuing for the sake of ultimately, essentially, possessing the woman. That's why the sex worker with a heart of gold story has to end with the woman leaving the sex industry for her new love. As long as she is selling sex, she belongs in part to her customers. The man in this story doesn't possess his partner until he is the sole recipient of the sexual pleasure she can give. But this concept of possession doesn't really exist so much in the side of the narrative sold to women. The goal is less to possess a man fully than it is to be chosen by him, and preferably to be chosen over plenty of other very desirable options. And this presents a real problem for Magic Mike's attempt to gender bend this trope. A former stripper may be generally considered desirable because of related trappings like washboard abs and dance skills, but a current stripper is hundreds of people's fantasy boyfriend every single night. The existence of a very specific, consensual context in which a partner sexually arouses hundreds of other women, any one of whom would happily run off with him at the drop of a hat, and then comes home to say, "Baby, none of them will ever do it for me like you do," that extends the moment of being chosen from something that happens in one sweeping romantic gesture into something that happens every single day. It plays right into the romantic fantasy sold to women. So it actually undermines the romance if stripping is a destructive force that Mike has to leave behind, but that's how the story is supposed to end. He's got a heart of gold, gosh dang it. And therein lies the real problem with Magic Mike for the women who bought the tickets we were sold. We were promised a fun girls' night out to gawk at some gorgeous men, and then we were shamed for wanting that when it's so clearly a destructive force in the lives of the men who do it. We were invited to be Joannas, party girls who like good-looking men and aren't too concerned with attaching strings to anything, and then told that we should aspire to be Brooks, obsessed with the harmful implications of our fun-loving desire, denying our own pleasure until we can have it in a societally acceptable, safe, sterilized, committed, monogamous way. There's an extent to which this dynamic exists and makes sense in the man's side of the narrative. Richard Gere may be too much of a gentleman to bang Julia Roberts in a by-the-hour motel and then send her on her merry way, but he does still pay her for sex before he can ultimately rescue her from all the guys who don't care about the well-being of strangers as much as he does. He can be horny and still prove that he's not like the other guys by being emotional, caring, and ostentatiously rich, because boys will be boys, and if not being horny were a precondition of being a good guy, there would be no good guys. Am I right? But Brooke can't enjoy the strip show, because if she did, she'd be a screaming fangirl, and they're only good for one-night stands and en masse ego boosts. Essentially, responsibility and wifeyhood are something men can grow into, especially if they do so because they've met a good woman worth growing up for. But an irresponsible woman is just an irresponsible woman. And honey, he might want you for tonight, but where's he gonna be in the morning? Where's your sense of self-worth, sweetie? He's not gonna buy the cow if he can get the milk for free. Whew. Okay, I have some really good news, which is that after all of that intense analysis, we're going to be able to cover the narrative function of XXL in like 30 seconds, because it handily avoids the pitfalls of its predecessor by essentially abandoning any interest in having a plot at all. The band's getting back together for a road trip ending in one last show, and that's basically it. There are specific personal insecurities for various guys to overcome, there's a truck crash, there's a new love interest of sorts for Mike who gets just enough screen time that you might remember her name by the end of the movie. Don't worry, Brooke dumped him for literally no reason when he proposed, so you don't have to feel bad about enjoying stripping anymore. Plus, now we know our guy isn't afraid of commitment. But really, this is all just here to get a bunch of really, really ridiculously good-looking men into one van and string together a series of panty-soaking dance numbers. Yes, where Magic Mike gender bent the sex worker with a heart of gold trope, XXL gender bends the slumber party porno. And thank God, because this video's been going on for like 15 minutes already, and we haven't even mentioned the naked men. Where are the naked men? Okay, but we do have to circle back to Magic Mike for a hot second, because it did, like, start it all and stuff, but also because we have to get a good idea of what went wrong to understand why XXL is such a dramatic improvement in this department. Now, look, I'm not saying there isn't some great stuff here. There are some nice bits and pieces. But, if you saw the trailers, you've already seen most of them. For a movie that dug in hard on the promise of erotic aesthetics, Magic Mike is pretty uninterested in presenting men's bodies in an aesthetically erotic way. Much of the stripping is portrayed in montages, cut to music that feels less sexy than it does kind of generally on top of its shit. And making liberal use of shots that show women in the audience screaming without showing what, specifically, is making them scream. When we do get extended takes of the performances themselves, they're most frequently wide angles showing the whole stage, relatively rarely cutting in with close-ups of faces or body parts in a way that would mimic the eye movements of a person watching the show. There are a very small handful of sequences that are filmed in a way that is unquestionably very sexy, but they're framed, narratively, in ways that demand that feel a little gross. Mike's performance to Pony features by far the most erotic camera work of the movie, but it's intercut with Brooke's uncomfortable reactions, which put a massive damper on things and reinforce that shaming dichotomy. And oddly enough, the camera is super comfortable with Dallas's one and only moment of actual stripping, but since this comes at a moment when it's so clear that this guy is the villain of the story who embodies everything destructive about stripping in Mike's life to the point where he's leaving the industry, and since the camera continues to focus in on Dallas's face as he, Scrooge McDucks through all this cash he is not going to share with his oldest friend and business partner, God, this is so uncomfortable to watch, no matter how pretty Matthew McConaughey is. And then there's the obsession with this angle from behind the performer looking out at the audience. It's the shot that starts the whole movie. Nearly every performance starts here, and they all frequently cut back to it. The overall effect isn't quite as if the camera is, homophobically cautious about truly erotic shot composition, but it definitely seems like this movie just considers eroticism to be the least interesting thing about men stripping. We're not really meant to watch this movie in the way the women in the audience would watch the performance. We're meant to identify with the men performing. You should probably remember that. I don't know, it might be important later. XXL, on the other hand, is all about the erotic aesthetic. Gone are the awkward montages, except for one of the guys literally doing a bunch of arts and crafts, bless their sensitive hearts. Replaced entirely with extended cuts of full numbers, culminating, of course, in the full, uninterrupted 20-minute Myrtle Beach show. The camera is unafraid of zooming in to cut these men into pretty pieces from time to time. Almost every single shot is from the point of view of the audience, or of an impossible observer positioned to get the absolute best view. That shot from the point of view of the performer still makes a few appearances, but it's no longer the main aesthetic framing device, and it's almost always used in a way that still gives us an unobstructed view of the way the performer's body moves. The angle only ever obscures the absolute sex of the performance during the gas station scene, where the camera is clearly taking on the cashier's less than optimal POV. In this case, it serves less to distance us from the eroticism of the situation than to emphasize the unrehearsed, spur-of-the-moment nature of the scene and make it feel more lighthearted and fun. There are still a whole lot of static wide shots, but they're composed in such a way as to center and accentuate the full, unobstructed body of the performer and show exactly how he relates to the women surrounding him. And that gets into something really interesting about the way in which the eroticism of XXL is specifically done up to appeal to women who like men, but it's going to involve the huge assertion that men and women just process erotic imagery differently, and I am not about to go there without the help of some people who have gone through a publication process much more rigorous than what's required to have opinions on YouTube.com, so...
Get sexy for me. Get sexy for me.
For context, let's start with an art theory classic. In the third essay of Ways of Seeing, John Berger sums up the difference between the ways in which men and women relate to art and the world by saying that men act and women appear.
Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at.
This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relations of women to themselves. She turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. It's important to understand here that Berger is not saying that women are complicit in our own objectification, but actually the opposite. Women are objectified by patriarchal society and learn, as a coping mechanism, to observe ourselves as objects, because for a woman,
how she appears to others, and particularly how she appears to men, is of crucial importance for what is normally thought of as the success of her life.
Berger explores this idea by examining the form and function of the nude in art. Paintings of nude women, Berger says, consistently portray a subject who is aware of being observed, both by the artist and by the person looking at the painting. In the art form of the European nude, the painters and spectator-owners were usually men, and the persons treated as objects usually women. This unequal relationship is so deeply embedded in our culture that it still structures the consciousness of many women. They do to themselves what men do to them. They survey, like men, their own femininity. This concept of self-observation has actually also been seen scientifically in the way that women interact with erotic images. A 2004 Northwestern University study measured both the objective physiological arousal and the self-reported subjective experience of arousal of straight and gay, cis men, cis women, and trans women while watching erotic video clips of man-woman couples, man-man couples, and woman-woman couples. There tended to be a major discrepancy between physiological and subjective arousal for cis women, which is really interesting, but very much outside the scope of this video. For the sake of argument, I'm going to be focusing on subjective arousal, which, to be fair, does give data which better supports my argument, but is also, I think, much more inherently relevant to this discussion. I don't know about you, but when I'm deciding whether or not to buy a ticket to a sexy movie, I don't pull out my vaginal photoplethysmograph and measure the change in my vaginal pulse amplitude. Alright, so cis men tended to be significantly more aroused by clips that showed people of the gender they reported being attracted to, and were most aroused by clips that showed two people of that gender. All cis men were at least somewhat aroused by man-woman clips, but gay men preferred man-man clips, and straight men preferred woman-woman clips. Cis women, on the other hand, all tended to be most aroused by clips that involved at least one woman. Cis lesbians, predictably, were most aroused by woman-woman clips, followed by man-woman clips. Straight cis women were most aroused by man-woman clips, followed by woman-woman clips. Now, trans women. There are a lot of problems with the way in which researchers involved them in the study, and they're going up on the screen now. But the takeaway for our purposes today is that, quote, most trans women gave high subjective arousal ratings only to clips which showed at least one member of their preferred sexual category and at least one female, which you'll notice is consistent with the kinds of clips preferred by cis women. So essentially, cis men were most aroused by clips showing the kinds of bodies they wanted to be sexual with, while women, both cis and trans, were most aroused by clips showing the kind of sexual relationship they wanted to be in, to the point where it was actually more important to them to see a body they could identify with than a body they were attracted to. A possible interpretation of this data is that it provides scientific support for Berger's argument that women learn to observe ourselves, particularly in an erotic context, to the point where it is our own image that we find erotic. This appears even more clearly in a 2007 University of Nevada, Las Vegas study, which tracked the eye movement of straight, cis men and women as they looked at both erotic and non-erotic images of man-woman couples. When looking at the erotic images, men spent significantly more time looking at the women in the pictures, particularly at their bodies. The women, on the other hand, spent about the same amount of time looking at the bodies of the men and the women in the pictures. This seems even more consistent with the idea that women experience arousal with an awareness of our own image. Unlike straight men who fixate on the bodies they are attracted to, straight women focus just as much on the bodies they identify with. And again, I do want to say that this does not necessarily describe every individual woman, or for that matter, every individual man. We are definitely not a monolith of mythical creatures, and there are variations within the data. But what I will say is that both Berger's theories about art and the conclusions of these studies resonate very distinctly with the way that I, personally, process erotic media, and the evidence points to the conclusion that I'm not alone. So, if, say, you were trying to make a movie with mass market appeal as an erotic fantasy for women, that might be a good thing to be aware of. So with that in mind, let's look at the change in the way XXL portrays the women in the audience. Magic Mike treats these women as hordes of fangirls who mostly serve to emphasize the power wielded by the men on stage. XXL, on the other hand, sees them as active participants on a nearly equal playing field with the performers. They don't just sit there and scream, they feel genuine pleasure. They react specifically to what's happening in front of them. They're involved. This is also important in the portrayal of the woman pulled from the audience. A lap dance in a club where women strip for men is at least a somewhat private affair, getting, in fact, more expensive as it becomes more private, creating the temporary illusion that the dancer belongs to the man paying her. A lap dance at a show where men strip for women, on the other hand, is a public celebration, allowing the women watching to latch onto an interaction they can imagine themselves participating in, and the woman on stage to bask in the envy of the entire room. XXL specifically demonstrates a solid understanding of the importance of this self-insert woman for the movie's audience, treating her not as a member of the screaming fangirl horde who just happens to be doing her screaming on stage, but as an integral character in the act. The camera brings these women in as important parts of the scene, showing not only a beautiful, skilled body the women watching the movie can desire, but a sexy experience we can project ourselves into. Narratively speaking, these women occasionally have a bit of explicit or speculative backstory that allows us to empathize and imagine ourselves in their shoes even more. The pinnacle of this, of course, is Mike's final act. Even more so than any other moment in the movie, the camera follows Zoe, zooming in on her face, following her emotional journey, making sure that we see her awkwardness melt into giggly enjoyment, inviting us to feel it with her in the moments that reel into genuine, public, sexual pleasure. And of course, this is enhanced by her flirtatious history with Mike. Not only has he actively singled her out, he's built his act around her, choosing music that deliberately references an inside joke.
I would take a pack of Oreos over that bullshit any day of the week. Nothing's wrong, because cookies are awesome.
Cookie, 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 I'm a cookie monster. I love a liquid middle like an Oreo.
This is no longer just a matter of being personally picked by the guy who could have anyone. This is a setup. This is all for her, and she has a whole audience of women to watch and drool in jealousy. And the part I didn't know I needed is that that's it. Not only does this ending completely reverse the awkward shame of the first movie, it affirms that it's okay to want to be worshipped by the hottest guy in the room with literally no strings attached. The classic rom-com ending would have Zoe and Mike riding off into the sunset together, but XXL seems to be aware that the actual power dynamic in this situation is skewed so far in Mike's favor that there's no way for that to be truly romantic. He's accomplished his goal of making her smile, and they go their separate ways. Holy shit. I also want to make sure to mention the importance of Rome to XXL's much more explicitly lady-friendly brand of eroticism. Working from the straight male understanding of the need for beautiful objects, Dallas would seem like the most intuitive choice to MC for an audience of women who like men. He's a good-looking guy, after all, and we came here for the eye candy, right? But an understanding of the importance of self-observation in a sexual context helps to clarify why Rome is actually a sexy as hell choice, even if you assume that most of the audience isn't attracted to women. Because even women who don't want to do her can still want to be her. Strutting around looking like sex incarnate even with all her clothes on, teasing and tantalizing the whole packed convention center audience, surrounded by the best looking men in the country and totally in charge of them with just the sultry sound of her voice. Well, you might see where this is going.
How about 50 Shades of Grey with a role reversal where the heroine's the boss?
Okay, so it sounds like I'm saying that Magic Mike f***ed up and XXL nailed it. And, I mean, XXL definitely misses it closer. There's an abundance of genuinely sexy set pieces here. But they're just set pieces. Look, I don't claim to speak for all people who like men, and I certainly won't say that 20 straight minutes of gorgeous movie stars humping floors and licking chocolate off of women's thighs doesn't do something for me. And there's an argument to be made that the way that XXL in particular treats men's bodies is very well crafted to appeal to men who like men. Although I would submit that the almost aggressively ever-present portrayal of heterosexuality, in part represented by the exclusively female audiences, significantly undermines that argument. But what I want to get at is more the overall function of these movies. Because for me at least, as much fun as I might have with any individual scene, the overwhelming feeling that both of these movies left me with wasn't an aching desire to get stolen away by Tarzan or be serenaded by Andre or do some acro yoga with Channing Tatum. It was how great it would be to be a male entertainer.
1, 2, 3.
Male entertainers. Get sexy for me. Get sexy for me.
Remember when I said Magic Mike finds genuine eroticism to be the least interesting thing about stripping? Well, this is the part where we talk about what it finds to be the most interesting part of stripping, and in this case, it's pretty easy. Dallas just tells us.
You are the man! On the stage, thousands of women. Eyes on you. You are their vision. Who's got the cock? You do, they don't.
Men don't strip for the sake of the women in the audience's pleasure. The women in the audience's pleasure exists for the sake of the power that the men stripping for them derive from it. Adam, originally drawn in by Mike's pickup artist skills, uses that power to get laid and, generally, to continue feeling superior for his refusal to grow up.
I have money. I can who I want to I'm having a ball.
Mike clings to the power he feels when stripping as it becomes more and more apparent that he is powerless to do the American thing and pull himself up by his bootstraps.
Does this look distressed? I don't think so.
It's partly the realization that Dallas is just gonna keep screwing him over on the business side of things that motivates him to finally get out. He's been made just as powerless by this industry as by the bank that considers him a distress case.
I'm distressed.
And that's really what Magic Mike is. A parable about emasculated disillusionment with the American dream, particularly as it has been sold to working class men. Josh Lewis puts it really well in his video, Magic Mike XXL, Make America Great Again.
The American dream, this idea that anyone and everyone can find financial success if they have the determination and work ethic to do so, is just as ridiculous a fantasy as sexy dudes in cowboy get-ups dancing to Save a Horse, Ride a Cowboy.
And if you've been paying attention, you might notice that that's a pretty weird look for a movie selling itself as a fun night to indulge in the fantasy of sexy dudes in cowboy get-ups dancing to Save a Horse, Ride a Cowboy. Put a pin in it. XXL, then, responds to this anxiety and disillusionment by whispering between the beats of Pony by Genuine, "There's a better way." Here we have a vision of masculinity that doesn't rely on a pipe dream of upward mobility or on the power derived from a nebulous, faceless mob of screaming women. Real men, says XXL, can be honest and open about their struggles, both financial and emotional. Real men have intimate friendships with other straight men, and they see women's pleasure, both sexual and otherwise, as a worthy end in and of itself.
See, somebody got the smile back.
And okay, at this point you might be thinking, okay, Laura, your pronouns are right there in your Twitter bio. What do you know about masculinity? To which I would say, I share this world with a lot of straight men, some of whom occasionally need to use me as a tool to assert said masculinity, so yeah, I know something. But, you know, yeah, it's true that that effect is an indirect one. Those pressures don't come down on me, so I can only really come at this from this cold, analytical angle. I can talk about what these movies are saying about straight masculinity on a technical level, but I can't really say much about whether it works. But, like, where am I supposed to find a straight guy willing to talk about liking movies about male strippers on the internet?
The infinite love I hold for this movie. This relic of pure objective beauty.
Okay, yeah, that'll work.
Get sexy for me. Get sexy for me.
Hello.
Hey, Zach, you know the Magic Mike movies?
Yeah, I'm familiar.
So I'm working on a video about how they speak to a straight male audience, but men on the internet scare me.
I'm a man on the internet? You just slid into my DMs after I tweeted at you a few times.
Yeah, exactly. You're one of the good ones. So, do you think you could just, like, say a few words about masculinity for me?
So you're asking me to stand in for all straight cis men?
What, you don't get that all the time?
I mean, on the whole, I'd rather not represent a group so largely reprehensible, but...
Look, I've got the big picture analysis covered. Can you just help me out with the personal touch?
Yeah, I think I could help you out. Alright, so being the straight cis-het dude that likes Magic Mike, how do I relate to the portrayals of masculinity in the movies? Well, the first one doesn't give me much to work with. Our main characters are Mike, Adam, and Dallas, and they're all kind of shitty. Mike and Dallas are really only concerned with getting money, and Adam is just a dumbass. He's meandering through life, falls upon this stripping gig wherein he just gets f***ed up all the time, instigates a fight with some frat boys, and then owes $10,000 to Tobias for losing all the drugs that he promised to sell for him, and gets Mike beat the shit out of him. As an ever-sober English major who writes essays and puts them up on the internet, Magic Mike's masculinity isn't exactly something I strive to become. I'll critique it, but I ain't lived it. Now, XXL. XXL's masculinity is like idyllic to me. I mean, I made a video about it. But what I wanted to say in that video, which you didn't have the guts to because being emotionally vulnerable is painful, is that XXL is sort of a wish fulfillment for me. It left such a huge impression on me because I got to live through the guys vicariously as they worshipped the women they encountered. I mean, that's why I stuck to that thematic point throughout the video. I get that desire to, for lack of a better term, worship at a very emotional level. So even though I'm watching a bunch of muscular dudes dance and thrust in front of me, I'm not really fazed by that. I'm comfortable enough with my sexuality to just get over it. In fact, I'm kind of in awe of their physique and dancing abilities. Seriously, Channing, F you for being able to dance so good. Anyway, yeah, I greatly admire the sex positivity and camaraderie of the masculinity in XXL. And yeah, sometimes I get the urge to drop everything and just become a stripper myself, learn to embody that whole lifestyle, get super buff, you know, do the whole shebang. But then I come back down to earth, realize, you know, what I have is okay, you know, and I can just use the movie as a form of fantasy.
So what you're saying is I basically nailed it?
I'd say so, yeah, you basically read my mind.
Cool, thanks, you're the best, bye! In all seriousness, you should definitely watch Zac's video on XXL's portrayal of masculinity, particularly as it pertains to women and their sexual pleasure. Between that piece and the Josh Lewis video I mentioned earlier, the topic has been very well covered here on YouTube.com, and I'm not going to spend too much time rehashing it here. But I do briefly want to mention something really interesting about the way these two movies interact with one another, which is that there are a few moments in XXL that directly refute the vision of masculinity that wrecks lives and relationships in Magic Mike. First, we've got this exchange between Adam and Mike.
I got this for you, just for gas. Shit. Are you kidding me, dude? Keep your money. It's fine. You drive me around all the time. I can pay for my own gas.
What's clear here is repeatedly emphasized over the course of this movie. A man pays for his own shit and doesn't take handouts from anyone.
Does this look distressed? I don't think so.
Compare this to XXL, where when Nancy hooks the guys up, there's no hesitation.
Miss Davidson called ahead, upgraded your rooms, and booked you our conference space.
Oh, what's up, Miss Davidson? Yeah.
Here, real men accept generosity, even if it means being a sugar baby. And then there's the idea of cross-dressing, which makes a brief appearance in Magic Mike. It's the oldest gag in the book. He's a man in a dress. It's funny, because he's not a lady. Get it? Compare this to the prevalence of drag in the first act of XXL. Now, I want to be clear that drag culture isn't my culture, and I absolutely do not get to say that there's nothing at all problematic about a group of super straight, super cis men strolling into a bar and absolutely taking over amateur night, especially when they themselves frame it as doing something extra crazy.
You guys really want to go down the rabbit hole? Isn't that what you said? I'm gonna go dig it for you, Alice. Let's see how far you're really willing to go.
But their unthreatened willingness to a man to participate and socialize, and Mike's use of a theoretical drag persona as a flirting strategy are definitely a far cry from that distinctly unfunny moment in the Marilyn Monroe wig. Again, I'm definitely not saying that there is nothing worth critiquing here, but it at least feels like a sizable step in the right direction. Real men can earnestly play with unconventional gender expression, and real men find drag queens a seat at the table. This same dynamic is reflected in the new act the guys come up with. Where the shows in Magic Mike were filled with the prescriptive trappings of societally approved masculinity, firemen, soldiers, construction workers, cowboys, the new acts of XXL play with less traditionally manly characters.
I'm not a f***ing fireman. You hate fire. I'm a f***ing male entertainer.
And it's worth noting, too, that these new acts suggest narratives that explicitly center the women invited on stage. A painter and his muse, a groom and his bride, a kid in his candy shop. Yeah, sure. Real men embrace sensitivity.
And people throw rice. Throwing rice.
And real men genuinely admire beautiful women. And that's what's so important to understand about XXL. This movie loves women, but it's consistently framed up around those real men. We follow the same group of guys for the whole 2 hours, with a couple of second act additions, but the women tend to come and go so quickly that it's tricky to really identify with any of them. Brownie points should be awarded for the sheer number of actresses employed in the making of what is essentially a boys' trip movie, and for quite a few of them being unapologetically older than what's usually considered acceptable, much less sexy, in Hollywood. But make no mistake, the only feasible options for audience insert characters are the guys. And this issue goes deeper than screen time down into narrative framing. Let's take another look at that gas station scene, which, to be clear, I cannot watch without cracking a big old smile right along with that cashier. It is a great scene. But as much time as we spend going back and forth between her and Richie, we spend just as much with the rest of the guys as they watch this play out. As much as this scene is about Richie trying to make this girl smile, it's really about all the guys realizing that they can do this. For an even more powerful example, take a look at the last shots of the movie. Yeah, we've just spent 20 minutes watching some sexy gyrating man meat, but the way we leave the theater is with Mike, smiling out over the water as All I Do Is Win plays. No matter how sexy everything that came before was, this is what we're walking away with. This is still about how great it is to be Magic Mike. XXL is a new, healthier, kinder power fantasy, but it's still a power fantasy. And I want to be really super clear, there's nothing wrong with that. Media made by men, for men, to address the ways in which traditional narratives of masculinity are failing them and craft a new concept of masculinity that sees women's sexual pleasure not only as integral to straight sex, but as empowering and meaningful to give in and of itself, that genuinely finds unqualified beauty in women who don't epitomize restrictive societal standards, that celebrates and centers intimate friendships with other men, that sees talking about feelings as better therapy than hitting people, that isn't threatened by women who are explicitly in charge or can write bigger checks than you, that can appreciate a delicious artisanal frozen yogurt right alongside a fancy car. That's really good, important stuff, and I'm really glad that it exists and has found at least some of the audience who can really benefit from it. And I had a great time watching it too, but there is a problem here. In case you forgot or missed it the first time around, here are some trailers for Magic Mike.
You are that dreamboat guy that never came along.
I was hoping this was all a joke.
It's pretty funny.
Magic Mike.
You don't need to talk, just look pretty.
Rated R.
And here's XXL.
Are you ready to be worshipped? Are you ready to be exalted?
These girls, all we gotta do is ask what they want.
Magic Mike was not sold as a parable for working class men feeling emasculated and incapable and disillusioned with the American dream. XXL was not sold as a healthy and inclusive alternative to toxic masculinity. They were both sold as fun fantasies for people, particularly women, who like looking at men's bodies in a sexual context. Now, I'm not saying every piece of media needs to be marketed precisely as the fullest extent of what it is. Sometimes you need to Trojan horse your feminism in a ruggedly masculine franchise to get it in front of the right eyeballs. But I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that if your movie is going to speak most effectively to a demographic known for resorting to implicit homophobia to prove their straight masculinity, then going in hard on how beautiful men's bodies are probably isn't gonna get those butts into seats. And while we're talking about trailers, let's talk about the ones that run with the DVD release, because this is great. Before the start of Magic Mike, a home viewer will be sold Cloud Atlas, Trouble with the Curve, Season 3 of The Vampire Diaries on Blu-ray, and The Campaign. In that order. What is happening? Who is this for? Apparently, nobody knows. For comparison, the DVD release of 50 Shades Freed runs with trailers for Breaking In, Thoroughbreds, and Molly's Game. Not only is there a very clear theme going on there, the understanding that the kind of woman who enjoys an erotic fantasy about being sexually dominated might also enjoy movies about women who are extremely in charge and empowered outside of the bedroom demonstrates a far more competent understanding of kink than literally anything in the 50 Shades trilogy. That's a package that was assembled by a team who knew exactly who they were talking to. This looks like it was put together by a cross-faded hipster with a dartboard. Now, I won't speculate about where exactly this disconnect happened. It could be that these movies were originally intended to be sex fantasies for women who like men and just missed the mark. It could be that they were always meant to be essentially what they are, and the decision was made to market them as sex fantasies for women who like men because women's sexual empowerment is so hot right now, and what self-respecting straight man wants to watch a bunch of men take their clothes off? What I will say, though, is that that muddiness is almost certainly not unrelated to the fact that these are movies made by a bunch of men. The only woman apparently credited behind the camera of Magic Mike is its editor, Mary Ann Bernard, who, as it turns out, is Steven Soderbergh working under a pseudonym. Now, normally, I would have some choice words about how disingenuous it is in this environment where we're finally starting to question and slowly starting to do something about the lack of women behind the camera in Hollywood for one of the more prolific men in Hollywood to work under a clearly female name, especially on a movie particularly marketed to women. But this is a name Soderbergh has a history of using anytime he does his own editing, so I guess I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that this is just about avoiding the room-style credits. But the headline is, not a single woman behind the camera. XXL adds Julie M. Anderson and Elaine Mongeon to the list of producer credits, and I would wager a guess that their influence has something to do with many of the improvements that I mentioned earlier, but otherwise the sequel sticks with the formula of a whole lot of manpower. And again, I want to be clear, there is nothing individually wrong with that. A movie that digs into the anxieties associated with the pressures of straight masculinity and a sequel that writes a new, liberating definition of straight masculinity probably should be made by a bunch of straight men. But this massive disconnect between the movies we were sold and the movies we got speaks to the problems with putting a bunch of straight men in charge of every movie. Whether these movies were originally meant to be sex fantasies for people who like men, or whether that angle was added on as a marketing strategy, what we have here is evidence of what happens when the straight male perspective is seen as default and therefore neutral. Filling up a bunch of rooms with straight men makes it really easy not to wonder whether there's a different way to process erotic imagery than the straight man way, much less in what way your target audience tends to work. It makes it really easy not to notice that your ostensibly erotic imagery is just set dressing for musings about your own identity, and it makes it really easy to assume that your audience will also only see the set dressing. Because when your perspective is the only one being represented, it's really easy to think that your perspective isn't a perspective. It's just the way things are. I've been dancing around 50 Shades for a lot of this video, so I guess I'd better out with it. I'm not here to say these movies are amazing, or even, like, good. I'm not here to say I'd personally choose to watch them over Magic Mike or XXL on any given movie night, and I'm definitely not here to say that they totally nail the feminine fantasy in a perfectly healthy way. But buried in there somewhere at its core, 50 Shades has its foundations in a much more coherent understanding of what it is that I, as a woman who likes men, want in an erotic fantasy than anything else currently happening at the blockbuster level. And it absolutely is not a coincidence that these are movies, one of which at least involved several women on the production end of things, based on novels written by a woman, adapting fan fiction of another set of romantic novels written by a woman, which are themselves loosely based on the literal mother of all romance novels written by a woman. Yes, there are problems. My God, are there problems?
Yeah.
But, like, there's a woman in the story the whole time. Everything that happens, especially the sex, is shown through her eyes. That sounds like it should be pretty simple not to screw up, but here we are. If you're most turned on by images of the kinds of bodies you want to bang, the more the better, you'll probably assume that everybody else is too, and without anyone around to call that into question, well, you get Magic Mike and XXL. You get so concerned with the nude, you don't bother to address the viewer, preferring instead to assume that changing the gender of one will take care of both. But if pythons and boxers have taught us anything, it's just not enough. If you liked this video and you want more analysis of media that men assume will be most marketable to women, you should check out Cold Take's video on the courtship of Princess Leia and romance novels. This video features music by all of these lovely people. Check out the description for a timestamped track list and for links to more of their stuff. Thanks again to Zac Frazier for collaborating on this video. Also, I have a Patreon now! If you want to help me make more and better videos, you can support me there, or you can give me a one-time tip on coffee.